In Copper Creek, Texas, a 70-year-old widower sat frozen in his pickup as a gang of bikers closed in. What began as a quiet stop for groceries turned deadly when the Serpent Brotherhood kicked dents into his truck and shattered glass with chains. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical diner regular. For decades, he had served as an elite martial artist, film legend, and military-trained hand-to-hand expert, known worldwide for turning impossible fights into one-sided victories. When Viper and his bikers swung chains and knives at an old man's truck, they had no idea they were picking a fight with a weapon in human form. Norris stepped into the street with calm precision, dismantling their attacks with effortless counters that triggered humiliation, chaos, and the collapse of their reign of fear. What began as small-town harassment would become open war. Copper Creek would never be the same after Chuck Norris made bikers eat asphalt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Copper Creek, Texas, its dying rays painting the horizon in streaks of amber and crimson. Heat rose from the cracked asphalt of Main Street in shimmering waves, even as shadows lengthened across the dusty storefronts. It was that liminal hour when day surrenders to night, when the desert air begins to cool but still carries the memory of afternoon's furnace. Inside Rosie's diner, ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, stirring the aroma of coffee and grease that had permeated the worn vinyl booths for decades. The place was half empty, with only the regulars scattered around. A couple of truckers nursing coffees, an old-timer doing his crossword, and in the corner booth farthest from the door, a solitary man. Chuck Norris sat with his back to the wall, a position that offered a clear view of both the entrance and the street beyond the windows. He wore faded jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles. Nothing about him demanded attention. He wasn't particularly large, and his calm demeanor suggested nothing extraordinary. Yet there was something in the way he held himself, a certain stillness, like a mountain lake, undisturbed by wind, that made him seem solid in a way few men are. Emily, the waitress who'd worked at Rosie's since high school, approached his table with a coffee pot. "Refill, sir?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft drawl of West Texas. Chuck nodded once, the movement barely perceptible, and pushed his mug forward. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet but clear. Emily filled his cup, noting how his eyes never stopped scanning the diner and the street beyond, though the movement was so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't looking. She'd first noticed him 3 days ago when he'd walked in alone, ordered coffee and the blue plate special, and then returned each day at the same time, always sitting in the same spot. He wasn't from around here. She knew everyone in Copper Creek, but he didn't have the restless energy of someone just passing through either. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked. "No, ma'am. This is fine," Chuck replied, offering a brief, polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Emily nodded and moved away, weaving between tables to check on her other customers. As she poured coffee for the truckers at the counter, she glanced out the window and felt her shoulders tense. In the distance, a dust cloud was rising from the highway, small at first, then growing larger as it approached town. "They're back," she murmured, her grip tightening on the coffee pot. The truckers followed her gaze and exchanged knowing looks. One of them cursed under his breath. The old-timer with the crossword folded his newspaper and laid a few bills on the table. "Think I'll head home before the fun starts," he said to no one in particular, and hurried out the door. Within minutes, the distant rumble became a growl, then a roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the diner. Half a dozen motorcycles thundered into town, chrome gleaming in the fading light, exhausts deliberately tuned to be as loud as possible. The riders were a ragtag collection of leather, denim, and tattoos, their faces hidden behind bandanas and sunglasses despite the hour. At their head rode a man the locals had come to know as Viper. Tall and rangy, with a shock of bleached hair and a beard trimmed to a point. He wore a sleeveless leather vest that displayed arms covered in prison ink, and around his neck hung a heavy chain that he sometimes used as a weapon. Viper wasn't his real name, of course, but it was what he called himself, and no one in Copper Creek was brave enough to question it. The bikers slowed as they passed the diner, revving their engines unnecessarily. One of them spat on the sidewalk. Another made an obscene gesture toward the window. Then, as if on cue, they all turned their bikes toward the Lone Star gas station across the street. Emily felt her heart sink as she watched them surround an old blue pickup truck that was parked by the pumps. Inside sat Walter Jenkins, a 70-year-old widower who ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. Walter had fixed cars in Copper Creek for 40 years, charging fair prices and sometimes accepting payment in homegrown vegetables or fresh eggs when folks were short on cash. "Oh no," Emily whispered. "Not Walter." Chuck's gaze followed hers out the window. He sipped his coffee, expression unchanged, but there was a new focus in his eyes, like a camera lens sharpening on a distant object. Outside, a small crowd began to gather as the bikers circled Walter's truck. Some were teenagers, drawn by the prospect of excitement in a town where nothing ever happened. Others were adults who should have known better. But curiosity and a shameful thrill of seeing someone else targeted had pulled them from their evening routines. A few looked genuinely concerned but kept their distance, afraid to become involved. Viper dismounted first, taking his time. He strutted toward the driver's side of the pickup, flanked by two of his crew, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and a younger guy with a spiderweb tattoo covering half his face. The others remained on their bikes, engines idling, creating a wall of noise that made conversation impossible. Walter Jenkins sat frozen behind the wheel. He'd come to town for his weekly groceries and to pick up his heart medication. Now he stared straight ahead, knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to make himself invisible, a futile strategy he'd learned in childhood, when bullies roamed his schoolyard. But invisibility never worked then, and it wouldn't work now. Viper made a theatrical show of leaning down to peer through the truck's window, then rapped on the glass with his knuckles. "Hey there, Grandpa," he called, voice loud enough to carry across the street. "Nice truck you got here, real classic." He ran his fingers along the dented fender with mock appreciation. Walter rolled down his window just a crack. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible over the motorcycles. "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Viper's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just admiring your ride." He turned to his crew. "Aren't we, boys?" The bikers laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the street and through the diner's walls. The heavy-set one stepped forward, and without warning, kicked the truck's door hard enough to leave a boot-shaped dent in the faded blue metal. Walter flinched at the impact. "Please," he said again, his voice cracking. "I need to get home." Viper ignored him, circling the truck slowly, running his hand along the hood. "Engine sounds rough," he commented. "You might need a tune-up." He picked up a handful of dust from the road and sprinkled it over the windshield. And a wash. Inside the diner, Emily set down her coffee pot with a sharp clack. "Someone should do something," she said to the truckers, who stared into their cups, suddenly fascinated by the black liquid. "They can't just keep coming here, terrorizing people." "And who's going to stop them?" one of the truckers replied. "Sheriff's office is 20 miles away, and Deputy Wilson is worse than useless." Emily glanced back at Chuck, who continued to watch the scene outside with the same quiet intensity. Something about his stillness made her nervous and hopeful all at once. Outside, the situation was escalating. The biker with the spiderweb tattoo had joined in, kicking another dent into the truck's passenger door while Viper laughed. Walter sat helplessly, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on some middle distance. The crowd had grown larger, with some people shooting videos on their phones, while others looked on uneasily. Then came a sound that cut through the motorcycle engines, the sharp crack of metal striking glass. Viper had taken the heavy chain from around his neck and swung it against the truck's side mirror, shattering it. Pieces of glass sparkled in the dust as they caught the last rays of sunlight. "Oops," Viper said, not bothering to hide his grin. "Looks like you lost a mirror, old-timer. How are you going to see what's coming up behind you now?" Inside the diner, Emily was reaching for the phone behind the counter. "I'm calling the sheriff," she announced, though she knew the closest deputy was at least 15 minutes away. If he bothered to come at all. She had just started to dial when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Chuck Norris had stood up from his booth. Nothing dramatic. He simply rose to his feet, laid a few bills on the table to cover his coffee, and began walking toward the door with the same unhurried stride he might use to cross his own living room. Emily's finger hovered over the phone's keypad. "Sir?" she called after him. "I wouldn't go out there if I were you. Those men are trouble." Chuck paused at the door. For the first time since he'd started coming to the diner, he looked directly at her. And Emily felt a strange chill run down her spine. His eyes were clear and calm, but there was something in their depths. Something that reminded her of her grandfather, who'd fought in 2 wars and never spoke about either. "Yes, ma'am," Chuck said quietly. "I can see that." Then he pushed open the door and stepped out into the Texas evening, moving from the fluorescent-lit diner into the golden haze of sunset. The door swung shut behind him, with a soft jingle of bells that seemed absurdly cheerful given what was happening across the street. Emily and the truckers watched through the window as Chuck crossed the road, his pace unhurried, his posture relaxed. He didn't look left or right, didn't check for traffic. Just walked straight toward the gas station, where Walter Jenkins sat trapped in his truck, surrounded by leather-clad predators who'd made sport of terrorizing the weak. One of the truckers whispered, "Holy shit! Is that who I think it is?" Emily shook her head slightly, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. "I don't know," she replied, "but I think those bikers are about to find out." The westering sun cast long shadows across the Lone Star gas station as Chuck Norris approached. Dust motes danced in the golden light, swirling in his wake like tiny constellations. The rumble of motorcycle engines formed a discordant backdrop to the seamy and ugly noise that had become all too familiar in Copper Creek these past few months. Walter Jenkins sat rigid behind the wheel of his battered pickup, a prisoner in his own vehicle. His weathered hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and his eyes, normally bright and alert despite his 70 years, darted nervously between the bikers surrounding his truck. A lifetime of hard work and quiet dignity reduced to this moment of public humiliation. Viper circled the truck like a predator, his chain dangling from one hand, occasionally striking the metal with a sharp crack that made Walter flinch. The heavy-set biker and the one with the spiderweb tattoo known to the crew as Hammer and Webbs continued their methodical destruction, kicking new dents into the doors and fenders with obvious enjoyment. "Look at this piece of junk," Viper called out to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying a performative edge. He wasn't just terrorizing Walter, he was putting on a show. "Probably older than dirt, just like its owner." Hammer laughed on cue, a harsh sound that held no genuine mirth. "Maybe we should help Grandpa here send it to the junkyard where it belongs." Walter's voice came small and strained through the partially open window. "Please. This truck was my father's. I've had it 40 years. 40 years? Viper pressed a hand to his chest in mock astonishment. "Well, that explains the smell. What is that, old man, in failure?" He leaned closer to the window, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "You know what I smell, old man? Fear. You reek of it." Walter looked away, eyes fixed on the dashboard, the shame of his helplessness evident in the slump of his shoulders. Around the gas station, the crowd had grown to nearly 30 people. Some watched with uncomfortable expressions, shifting their weight from foot to foot, wanting to intervene, but lacking the courage. Others, mostly younger men, laughed along with the bikers, eager to be on the right side of power, even if it was ugly. No one noticed Chuck at first as he crossed the street. He moved with purpose but without hurry, like a man who knows exactly where he's going and sees no reason to rush. By the time he reached the edge of the gas station's concrete apron, however, heads began to turn. One of the bikers, still mounted on his motorcycle, spotted him first. "Hey, Viper," he called out, nodding in Chuck's direction. "We got company." Viper straightened up from where he'd been leaning into Walter's window and turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. He squinted against the setting sun, taking in the newcomer, nothing particularly impressive at first glance. Average height, trim build, probably in his 60s, dressed in ordinary clothes. The kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second look. But something made Viper pause. Maybe it was the way Chuck moved with a fluid economy that suggested more strength than his frame revealed. Or perhaps it was his expression, not angry, not frightened, just intensely focused, like a man reading fine print. Viper recovered quickly, a smirk spreading across his face. "Well, well, what have we here? The town welcoming committee?" Chuck stopped about 10 feet away, his gaze moving deliberately from Walter's frightened face to the dented truck to the chain dangling from Viper's hand. He said nothing, just stood there, taking it all in with methodical calm. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Bikers exchanged glances. The crowd grew quieter, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Inside his truck, Walter dared to look up, hope flickering briefly in his eyes. Viper, unused to being ignored, stepped forward, deliberately invading Chuck's personal space. "You got something to say, old man? Or are you just enjoying the show?" Chuck's gaze finally settled on Viper's face. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying easily despite the idling motorcycles. "I think the gentleman wants to leave." A beat of silence. Then Viper burst into exaggerated laughter, turning to his crew. "You hear that, boys? The gentleman wants to leave." He faced Chuck again, amusement hardening into something uglier. "And who's going to make that happen? You?" Chuck didn't respond, didn't move, didn't change expression. He simply maintained that steady gaze, as if waiting for Viper to hear his own question and recognize its answer. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to those watching, it seemed to stretch into minutes. The world narrowed to these two men, loud and theatrical, bristling with aggression. The other still and contained, like a drawn bow. Viper, unnerved by Chuck's silence but unwilling to show it, raised his chain slightly. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Grandpa." The corner of Chuck's mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement of an irony only he understood. "I was thinking the same thing." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty behind the simple statement, caused a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. A few people edged closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Viper felt the attention shifting away from him, and it angered him. He'd worked hard to build his reputation in this part of Texas, to make sure his name inspired fear. He wasn't about to let some old man undermine that with a few cryptic words. "Boys," he called out, not taking his eyes off Chuck. "I think we need to teach this guy some manners. Show him how we deal with busybodies in our town." At his signal, Hammer and Webbs moved to flank Chuck, while two more bikers dismounted and approached from behind, attempting to form a circle around him. Chuck noted their movements without turning his head, his posture unchanging. From inside the diner across the street, Emily watched with her hand pressed against her mouth. The truckers stood beside her, one of them muttering, "This is going to be bad." Walter Jenkins, seeing what was about to happen, suddenly found his courage. He pushed his door open, struggling against one of the fresh dents. "Leave him alone," he called out, his voice cracking. "This is between you and me." Viper barely spared him a glance. "Get back in your truck, old man, unless you want to join him." Walter hesitated, torn between his fear and his conscience. But Chuck gave him the slightest shake of the head, a silent instruction to stay put. Walter reluctantly sank back into his seat, but he left the door open, watching intently. "Last chance to walk away," Viper said to Chuck, twirling his chain now. "Though I gotta say, I'm hoping you don't take it." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Chuck's gaze never wavered. "There's still time for you to apologize to this man, fix his truck, and leave town." A beat of silence. Then Viper threw back his head and laughed at a sound with no humor in it. Just contempt. "You hear this guy?" he called to his crew. "Wants us to apologize and fix the truck." He leaned in closer to Chuck, voice dropping to a menacing growl. "How about instead, we put you in the hospital, and then finish what we started with Grandpa's piece of junk?" Chuck sighed slightly, as if disappointed but not surprised. "Your choice." Viper's patience snapped. With a fluid motion born of practice, he swung his chain at Chuck's head, a vicious arc that would have caused serious damage if it had connected. But Chuck wasn't there anymore. He had shifted just enough for the chain to whistle past his ear, the movement so economical it almost looked like Viper had simply missed. Unbalanced by his failed attack, Viper stumbled slightly. Before he could recover, Chuck's hand shot out, grasped the chain in mid-swing, and with a sharp twist, yanked it from Viper's grip. The move was so fast, so smooth, that many in the crowd would later swear they didn't actually see it happen, just its result. Viper stared at his empty hand for a split second, disbelief etched on his face. That moment of hesitation cost him. Chuck's foot connected with the side of his knee, not with brutal force, but with precisely applied pressure that collapsed Viper's leg beneath him, sending him sprawling to the dusty concrete. The crowd gasped collectively. Inside the truck, Walter's eyes widened. Hammer and Webbs, seeing their leader down, charged simultaneously. Hammer threw a wild haymaker aimed at Chuck's temple, while Webbs attempted to tackle him from the side. Chuck pivoted smoothly between them, redirecting Hammer's momentum with a subtle shift that sent the big man staggering past him. In the same fluid motion, he sidestepped Webbs's charge, adding a precisely placed foot that sent the younger biker sprawling face first onto the pavement. It happened so quickly that the two bikers approaching from behind barely had time to register their comrade's failure before Chuck was turning to face them. Something in his expression, not anger, not even exertion, just focused intent, made them hesitate. That hesitation was all Chuck needed. He moved forward, not backward as they'd expected, closing the distance in 2 swift steps. A short, sharp jab to one biker's solar plexus doubled him over, gasping for breath. The other managed to grab Chuck's shirt, but before he could follow up, Chuck trapped his arm, twisted, and used the man's own momentum to flip him over his hip. The biker hit the ground with enough force to drive the air from his lungs, lying there stunned and wheezing. 4 men down in less than 15 seconds, and Chuck had barely seemed to move. The remaining bikers, still on their motorcycles, revved their engines uncertainly. One of them shouted, "What the hell, Viper? Get up!" Viper had managed to get to one knee, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You're dead," he spat at Chuck. "You hear me? Dead." Chuck, who had been standing perfectly still since disposing of the 4th biker, simply looked at him. There was no triumph in his expression, no anger, just a quiet assessment, like a man checking to see if a job was finished. Viper reached behind his back and pulled out a switchblade, the 6-inch blade snapping open with a metallic click that silenced the crowd. "Nobody does that to me," he snarled. "Nobody." A woman in the crowd screamed. Someone else shouted, "He's got a knife!" People began backing away. But no one left the scene before them too compelling, too shocking to abandon. Chuck's expression didn't change. He didn't back away, didn't raise his hands, didn't show any reaction to the blade, now pointing at his midsection. He simply waited, his posture balanced and ready. Viper lunged forward, blade extended, aiming for Chuck's abdomen. What happened next would later be described by witnesses in contradictory ways, as if they'd all seen different events. Some would swear that Chuck knocked the knife away with a karate chop. Others would insist he caught Viper's wrist and twisted. A few would claim that Viper simply missed and fell. What everyone agreed on was the result. Viper ended up face down on the pavement, his own knife pressed against the back of his neck, with Chuck kneeling beside him, applying just enough pressure to keep him immobile without breaking the skin. "That's enough," Chuck said quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "It's over." Viper struggled briefly, then went still as the knife pressed a fraction deeper. "Get off me," he growled, but the command lacked conviction. "In a moment," Chuck replied. "First, you're going to apologize to Mr. Jenkins for damaging his truck and frightening him." "The hell I will," Viper spat. Chuck applied slightly more pressure, and Viper went rigid. "Reconsider," Chuck suggested mildly. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the idling motorcycles and Viper's harsh breathing. Then, through clenched teeth, he muttered, "Sorry about your truck, old man." "Louder," Chuck instructed, "so everyone can hear you." Viper's face contorted with hatred, but he raised his voice. "I said I'm sorry about your damn truck." Chuck nodded slightly. "Good. Now, you and your friends are going to leave town. Tonight. And you're not coming back." "You can't make us," Viper began. But Chuck cut him off with the slightest increase in pressure from the knife. "I'm not going to argue with you," Chuck said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You're leaving. The only question is whether you're leaving on your motorcycles or in an ambulance." He stood up in one smooth motion, taking the knife with him and stepping back to give Viper room to rise. The biker got to his feet slowly, rubbing his wrist where Chuck had gripped it, hatred burning in his eyes. For a moment, it seemed like he might try to attack again, but a quick glance at his Kree-wall, still recovering from their encounters with Chuck, told him that would be unwise. Instead, he pointed a shaking finger at Chuck. "This isn't over." Chuck twirled the switchblade once, then folded it closed with a practiced movement. "Yes," he said simply. "It is." He turned his back on Vipera, deliberate display of dismissal, and walked over to Walter's truck. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been moments before. Walter nodded, his eyes wide with amazement. Yes. Thank you." Chuck glanced at the damaged truck, assessing the dents and the broken mirror. "Sorry about your vehicle. If you've got the parts, I'm pretty handy with tools. I could help you fix it up." Walter stared at him for a long moment. Then a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Son, after what you just did, I'd let you rebuild the whole damn engine if you wanted to." Behind them, Viper had remounted his motorcycle, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. "You'll regret this," he shouted over the engine's roar. "Both of you!" Chuck didn't bother to turn around. He just raised one hand in a dismissive wave, as if shooing away an annoying insect. With a final rev of engines, the bikers peeled out of the gas station, spraying gravel and dust. They thundered down Main Street toward the highway, their noise fading gradually until Copper Creek was quiet once more. The crowd remained frozen for a moment, as if unable to process what they had just witnessed. Then, like a dam breaking, they erupted in excited chatter. Some rushed forward to clap Chuck on the back or shake his hand. Others pulled out phones to capture the aftermath, though they'd missed recording the actual confrontation in their shock. Emily came hurrying across from the diner, her face flushed with excitement. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen," she exclaimed, stopping just short of hugging Chuck. "Are you okay? Do you need ice for your hand or anything?" Chuck shook his head, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm fine, ma'am. Thank you." One of the truckers approached, grinning widely. "Man, I thought I recognized you when you first walked in, but I wasn't sure till now. You're Chuck Norris, aren't you? The real deal." A murmur went through the crowd as the name registered. People began whispering to each other, pointing, pulling out phones again to try to get pictures. Chuck just nodded once, neither confirming nor denying, his expression suggesting that his identity was far less important than what had just happened. He turned back to Walter. "Let's see about getting you home, sir. I think you've had enough excitement for one day." As the two men inspected the truck to see if it was still drivable, the crowd gradually dispersed, though many lingered at the edges of the gas station, still buzzing with excitement. The story of what had happened would spread through Copper Creek like wildfire, growing with each retelling until it achieved almost mythic proportions. But the core of it would remain unchanged. On an ordinary evening in a dusty Texas town, a quiet stranger had stood up against cruelty and reminded everyone what real strength looked like. The news of what happened at the Lone Star gas station spread through Copper Creek faster than a prairie fire. By the time darkness fully claimed the Texas sky, nearly everyone in town had heard about the stranger who'd taken down Viper and his crew without breaking a sweat. With each retelling, the story grew more elaborate. 5 bikers became 8, then 12. The knife became a machete. Chuck's moves became increasingly spectacular. But the essence remained the same. Someone had finally stood up to the terror that had gripped their town for months. Walter Jenkins' truck, despite its new dents and missing mirror, was still drivable. After a quick inspection, Chuck had helped the older man gather his groceries and medication, then followed him home in a rented Jeep to make sure he arrived safely. Walter had tried to invite him in for dinner, desperate to express his gratitude, but Chuck had politely declined. "Another time," he'd said, with a smile that softened his otherwise serious face. "You've had enough excitement for one day." Then, he'd driven back to town, checking into the small motel on the outskirts of the Desert Palms. A modest establishment, with 12 rooms, and a neon sign that flickered erratically after sunset. If he'd hoped to maintain a low profile, however, that possibility had vanished the moment he'd confronted Viper. The next morning found Chuck back at Rosie's diner, sitting in the same corner booth, drinking the same black coffee. But everything else had changed. The place was packed, every booth and counter stool occupied, with people standing by the door, hoping for a glimpse of the man who'd become an overnight legend in Copper Creek. Emily moved between tables with a coffee pot, her usual efficiency hampered by customers stopping her to ask questions about Chuck. "Yes, he comes in every day," she'd say. "No, I don't know how long he's staying." "Yes, that's really him." She refilled Chuck's cup with an apologetic smile. "Sorry about all this. Word travels fast in small towns." Chuck nodded his thanks for the coffee. "So I see. People are saying you're some kind of, I don't know, martial arts expert or something?" She phrased it as a question, giving him an opening to explain his presence in Copper Creek if he chose to. Chuck took a sip of coffee, his expression neutral. "Just passing through, ma'am." Emily accepted his reticence with a nod. Whatever his reasons for being in town, he'd earned the right to his privacy. "Well, Walter's telling everyone who'll listen how you saved him yesterday. I think you made a friend for life there." A small smile briefly crossed Chuck's face. "He seems like a good man." "The best," Emily agreed, Fixed my car last winter and barely charged me for parts, let alone labor. She glanced around the crowded diner, lowering her voice. Listen, those bikers. They've been terrorizing folks around here for months. Sheriff's office is understaffed and 20 miles away. Deputy Wilson is scared of his own shadow. What you did yesterday. She paused, searching for words. Well, let's just say a lot of people around here are sleeping easier because of it. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he understood the weight of what she was saying. He simply nodded once, then returned to his coffee. Emily was called away to another table, leaving Chuck to his thoughts. He sat quietly, observing the diner's patrons while appearing to focus on his breakfast. He noted the nervous glances some cast toward the door, the way conversations hushed when the rumble of a passing truck momentarily resembled motorcycle engines. Despite his actions yesterday, fear still had a grip on Copper Creek. He was just finishing his meal when the diner's door swung open, bringing a blast of hot air and the sound of approaching motorcycles. Conversations died instantly. Heads turned. Silverware clattered onto plates as people froze mid-bite. But it wasn't Viper. Instead, Walter Jenkins stood in the doorway, his weathered face creased in a wide smile. He spotted Chuck immediately and made his way through the crowded diner, nodding to people he'd known his entire life. "Morning, Chuck," he said, extending a hand. "Thought I might find you here." Chuck stood and shook the offered hand. "Mr. Jenkins, how are you feeling today?" Walter waved away the formality. "Walter, please. And I'm feeling just fine, thanks to you." He gestured to the booth. "Mind if I join you? Got something I want to discuss." Chuck motioned for him to sit. Emily appeared almost instantly with a fresh pot of coffee and a mug for Walter. "The usual, Walter?" she asked. "You know it, sweetheart," Walter replied, with a wink. As Emily walked away, Walter leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the fact that half the diner was straining to eavesdrop. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. Those boys, they're not going to just ride away and forget about it. Not Viper, anyway. He's got too much pride for that." Chuck nodded slightly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, just acknowledging that he'd heard. "Thing is," Walter continued, "I've lived in Copper Creek my whole life. These people," he gestured around the diner, "they're good folks. Hard-working. Decent. They don't deserve to live in fear of a bunch of thugs." "No," Chuck agreed quietly. "They don't." Walter studied him for a moment, as if trying to read something in his impassive features. "I got a call this morning from Pete Wilson. He owns the hardware store. Said 2 of his windows got smashed overnight. Nothing stolen, just vandalized. Sound like anyone we know?" Chuck's expression remained neutral, but something hardened in his eyes. "Could be coincidence," Walter snorted. "In Copper Creek? We go years without so much as a bicycle theft. Then, suddenly, right after someone stands up to Viper, random property damage happens?" He shook his head. "They're sending a message." Before Chuck could respond, the diner's door crashed open. Deputy Wilson stood there. A thin man in his 30s with a nervous demeanor that his uniform and badge did nothing to disguise. His gaze darted around the room until it landed on Chuck and Walter. "Mr. Norris?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Need to have a word with you, sir." A hush fell over the diner as Chuck stood, wiping his mouth with a napkin before walking calmly to where the deputy waited. "What can I do for you, officer?" Deputy Wilson swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "Got a complaint about an incident at the gas station yesterday. Assault charges." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the diner. Walter half rose from his seat, face flushing with anger. "That's bull." Chuck raised a hand slightly, silencing him without looking back. "Who filed the complaint, deputy?" "Man named Jason Vickers. Goes by Viper, apparently." Wilson couldn't quite meet Chuck's eyes. Says you attacked him and his friends unprovoked. Claims you threatened him with his own knife. A chorus of protests erupted throughout the diner. Emily stepped forward, coffee pot still in hand. That's not what happened, Deputy Wilson, and you know it. Viper and his thugs were terrorizing Walter. They damaged his truck. I understand, Miss Hawkins, Wilson interrupted, his voice strained. But I've got to follow procedure here. Chuck nodded once. Of course you do, Deputy. I'm happy to give a statement. Walter pushed his way to Chuck's side. I was there, Deputy. I saw the whole thing. Those boys were vandalizing my property, threatening me. Mr. Norris here just intervened to help an old man in trouble. Wilson looked relieved at the potential solution. That would be helpful, Mr. Jenkins. I'll need statements from both of you. He hesitated, then added in a lower voice. Look, I don't want any trouble. But Viper called the sheriff directly. And you know how Sheriff Daniels is about procedure. Chuck's expression remained calm. No trouble at all, Deputy. I understand you're just doing your job. As the three men prepared to leave, the diner's door swung open again. This time, the rumble of motorcycles was unmistakable and much closer. The atmosphere in the room instantly changed, tension crackling like static electricity before a storm. Through the large front windows, they could see 5 motorcycles pulling up outside, Viper at the lead. Unlike yesterday, when they'd worn an assortment of leather and denim, today the bikers were uniformly dressed in their full colors, black leather vests over bare chests, displaying a crude snake emblem on the back. Each man wore dark sunglasses despite the early hour, and Viper had a white bandage wrapped around his wrista, visible reminder of yesterday's confrontation. Deputy Wilson's face drained of color. Oh hell, he muttered, one hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip, though he didn't draw it. Chuck remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the bikers through the window. Walter moved slightly closer to him, as if seeking protection. Throughout the diner, people began to slide out of booths, moving away from the windows, mothers pulling children close. Viper dismounted first, removing his sunglasses with deliberate slowness. Even from inside, they could see the bruise darkening his left cheekbone, and the split in his lip, more souvenirs from his encounter with Chuck. He said something to his crew, and they all laughed, the sound carrying faintly through the glass. Maybe I should call for backup, Wilson said, reaching for his radio. From where? Walter asked bitterly. By the time anyone gets here from the county seat, this could all be over. Chuck's gaze never left Viper. It's all right, Deputy. I don't think they're here for trouble. Not the kind you're thinking of, anyway. As if on cue, Viper looked directly at the diner window, his gaze finding Chuck unerringly despite the distance and the glare on the glass. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He raised his voice, loud enough to carry clearly. Hey, Norris. Heard you're still in town. Thought you might want a rematch fair and square this time. Inside the diner, people exchanged nervous glances. Deputy Wilson's hand tightened on his gun. I should go out there. Tell them to move along. No. Chuck's voice was quiet but firm. That's what he wants. An audience. Authority to push against. He turned to Wilson. Let me handle this. Wilson hesitated, torn between relief at not having to confront the bikers himself and concern about letting a civilian walk into potential danger. I don't know if that's... Trust me, Deputy, Chuck said, his tone making it clear this wasn't actually a request. I've dealt with men like this before. Without waiting for a response, Chuck moved toward the door. Walter made to follow him, but Chuck shook his head slightly. Stay inside, please. All of you. His gaze swept the diner, making eye contact with several patrons who looked ready to join him. This doesn't need to involve anyone else. He pushed through the door and stepped out into the morning sunshine. The heat hit him immediately. It was barely 9 o'clock, and already the temperature was pushing 90 degrees. The asphalt of the parking lot shimmered with rising heat, giving the scene a dreamlike quality. Viper and his crew remained by their bikes across the street, watching Chuck's approach with the focused attention of predators. Behind them, the gas station where yesterday's confrontation had occurred was eerily empty, the owner having apparently decided to delay opening. Chuck stopped in the middle of the street, directly between the diner and the gas station neutral territory. He stood relaxed, hands at his sides, nothing in his posture suggesting either aggression or fear. He simply waited. Viper sauntered forward, his attempts to move normally betrayed by a slight limp, another remnant of yesterday's encounter. He stopped about 10 feet from Chuck, just out of striking distance. His crew stayed with their bikes, watching intently. Well, Viper drawled, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. If it isn't the Karate Kid himself, little old for the part, aren't you? Chuck didn't respond, just watched him with that same unreadable expression. Viper's smirk faltered slightly at the lack of reaction, but he pressed on. You know, I've been doing some research on you. Chuck Norris, the big shot action star. All those fancy moves in your movies. He spat on the ground. Wonder how many of those were actually stunt doubles. From the diner, nearly everyone had pressed close to the windows, watching the confrontation unfold. Deputy Wilson stood with his hand still on his holstered weapon, but he made no move to intervene. I'm not here for trouble, Chuck said finally, his voice calm and measured. And neither are you, if you're smart. Viper's face darkened. Is that right? You think because you got lucky once, you can just tell me what to do in my own town? He raised his voice, playing to the audience he knew was watching. This ain't your movie set, Norris. There's no director to yell, "Cut," when things get real. Chuck sighed slightly, the sound barely audible. This isn't your town. It belongs to good people like Walter Jenkins and Emily Hawkins. People who work hard and look out for each other. He paused, his gaze never leaving Viper's face. People who deserve better than to be terrorized by men like you. Viper's expression twisted with rage. Who the hell do you think you are? Coming into my territory telling me what people deserve? He took a step closer, entering Chuck's space. You don't know anything about this place or these people. I know enough, Chuck replied simply. I know bullies like you are all the Sam loud and dangerous in a crowd. Weak and scared when standing alone. A vein pulsed in Viper's temple. You calling me scared, old man? He glanced back at his crew, as if seeking reassurance, then returned his glare to Chuck. I'm not the one who needed a sucker punch to win a fight. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been pity, seemed to infuriate Viper further. You think you're something special? Viper snarled, his voice rising. You ain't nothing but a washed-up actor playing hero in a town too pathetic to stand up for itself. He gestured wildly toward the diner. Look at them hiding behind glass, watching like it's another one of your B-movies. They won't help you. They're too scared. They shouldn't have to help me, Chuck replied, his voice still calm. And they shouldn't have to be scared either. Not in their own home. Viper laughed, an ugly sound with no humor in it. Their home? Please. This dump is just a pit stop for my crew. A place to have some fun when we're bored. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. And we get bored a lot, Norris. You won't always be around to play protector. Chuck met his gaze steadily. I don't have to be. Once people see that men like you can be stood up to, they find their own courage. Viper's face contorted with rage. Is that what this is? Some kind of inspirational moment for the locals? He spat again, this time deliberately close to Chuck's boots. Let me explain something to you. After you're gone, and you will be gone, I'm still here. And I've got a long memory for people who cross me. Chuck didn't flinch. Didn't look down at the spittle on the asphalt near his foot. Is that a threat? Call it a promise. Viper growled. Starting with that old man and his piece of junk truck. Maybe next time we visit, we don't just dent it. Maybe next time it burns. Something changed in Chuck's expression, then subtle, almost imperceptible. But Viper caught it and took an instinctive half-step back before he could stop himself. Let me make something clear, Chuck said, his voice lower now, meant only for Viper, despite the audience watching from the diner. Yesterday was a warning. I held back because that's who I am. I don't look for fights, and I don't hurt people more than necessary. He paused, letting the words sink in. But if you or your crew come near Walter Jenkins, or anyone else in this town, again, you'll wish I hadn't been so restrained. Viper tried to maintain his sneer, but sweat had broken out on his forehead that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. You threatening me in front of a police officer, Norris? He gestured toward the diner where Deputy Wilson watched. That's not very smart. It's not a threat, Chuck replied evenly. It's a fact. Like gravity or the sunrise, some things just are. He took a single step forward, closing the distance between them to mere inches. Though of similar height to Viper, Chuck suddenly seemed to tower over him, his presence filling the space between them. You have a choice to make right now. Ride away and find somewhere else to be. Or stay, cause more trouble, and deal with the consequences. For a long moment, neither man moved. The onlookers in the diner held their collective breath. Even the bikers across the street seemed frozen, waiting for their leader's response. Viper's jaw worked as he struggled with his options. The smart move, the safe move, would be to back down, save face with some parting insult, and leave. But backing down wasn't how he'd built his reputation. Wasn't how he maintained control over his crew. He'd lose respect, maybe even leadership. His hand twitched toward his back pocket, where another knife waited. Chuck saw the movement and shook his head slightly. Don't, he said quietly. Just that one word, loaded with absolute certainty. Viper's hand stilled. Something in Chuck's tone, in his unwavering gaze, told him that drawing that knife would be the last mistake he ever made. For all his bluster, for all his experience in bar fights and street brawls, he suddenly knew with bone-deep certainty that he was outmatched in every way that mattered. Fury and humiliation warred on his face. Then, with a final glare, he stepped back. This isn't over, Norris. Chuck remained where he stood. Yes, he said, echoing his words from yesterday. It is. Viper held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and stalked back to his motorcycle, his limp more pronounced now. He mounted without looking back, gunned the engine with unnecessary force, and shouted something to his crew. As one, they revved their bikes and peeled out of the gas station, spraying gravel and dust. Chuck watched them go, standing motionless in the middle of the street until the roar of their engines faded into the distance. Only then did he turn and walk back toward the diner, his expression giving away nothing of what he might be feeling. Inside, the patrons erupted in cheers and applause as he entered. People surged forward to clap him on the back, shake his hand, offer thanks. Emily pushed through the crowd with a fresh cup of coffee, her eyes shining with what might have been tears. That was incredible, she said, pressing the mug into his hands. I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that. Walter was right behind her. His weathered face split in a wide grin. Thought for sure there was going to be another fight. But you didn't even have to throw a punch this time. Chuck accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. Sometimes words are enough, if they're the right ones. He glanced at Deputy Wilson, who was watching from near the door, relief evident on his face. I think your assault complaint just rode out of town, Deputy. Wilson looked sheepish. Seems that way. Still need your statement for the paperwork, though. Of course, Chuck agreed. After breakfast? As he made his way back to his booth, people continued to approach, wanting to shake his hand or simply be near him. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed completely. Yesterday, it had been filled with tension and fear. Now there was a palpable sense of relief, of community restored. Chuck settled back into his corner booth, sipping his fresh coffee and watching as the town of Copper Creek began, tentatively but unmistakably, to reclaim itself from the shadow of fear that had hung over it for too long. By mid-afternoon, Copper Creek simmered under a merciless Texas sun, the temperature climbing past 100 degrees. Heat waves danced above the cracked asphalt of Main Street as Chuck Norris sat in his usual corner booth at Rosie's Diner, watching the town through the large front windows. The morning's confrontation with Viper had spread through Copper Creek like wildfire, transforming Chuck from a mysterious stranger into something approaching a local legend. Throughout the day, people had found excuses to visit the diner, hoping for a glimpse of the man who'd stood down the notorious biker gang without throwing a single punch. Emily approached with a fresh glass of iced tea. "You're good for business," she said with a smile. "Rosie said your money's no good here anymore." Chuck nodded his thanks, uncomfortable with the attention. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Before Emily could respond, the diner's door opened. A silver-haired woman in her early 60s entered, her movements carrying a quiet dignity despite her simple clothes. She spotted Chuck immediately and approached his booth. "Mr. Norris? I'm Sarah Jenkins, Walter's sister." Chuck rose slightly, extending his hand. "Ma'am. Please, have a seat." Sarah slid into the booth, her clear blue eyes so like Walter's studying him intently. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did for my brother yesterday. Walter's all the family I have left." "No need for thanks," Chuck replied. "Your brother seems like a good man. I just did what anyone would do." A sad smile crossed Sarah's face. "But that's just it, isn't it? No one else did. Not for Walter. Not for any of the others Viper's gang has terrorized these past months." She glanced around the diner. "There are plenty of men in this town younger, stronger than my brother. But when those bikers started causing trouble, most folks just looked the other way." Chuck said nothing. Having seen this pattern before in small towns across the country, people paralyzed by fear, caught between the instinct to protect their own and the knowledge that standing alone against violence often led to more violence. "Walter told me Viper threatened him again this morning," Sarah continued, lowering her voice. "Said something about burning his truck next time." Chuck's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "Did Walter report that to Deputy Wilson?" Sarah laughed softly, without humor. "Deputy Wilson is a nice young man, but he's in over his head. The real sheriff is 20 miles away and stretched too thin to worry about what he sees as petty vandalism." Her weathered hands clasped together on the table. "I'm asking you to look out for my brother, just for a little while longer. Until we're sure Viper and his gang are really gone." Before Chuck could respond, the sound of approaching engines drew their attention. 3 large pickup trucks pulled into the gas station across the street. Men began climbing out, 6 in total, all in work clothes stained with sweat and dust. Their leader was instantly recognizable, a big man in his 50s with a ruddy complexion and a salt and pepper beard. "That'll be Hank Dawson and his boys," Sarah said, disgust evident in her voice. "Walter's shop is right next to Hank's ranch supply store. They've had bad blood for years over a property line dispute. Hank never liked Walter much," Sarah continued, as they watched the men enter the gas station's convenience store. "But things got worse when Walter opposed Hank's plans to develop the old Peterson property into an ATV park." Chuck nodded slightly. "I take it Mr. Dawson didn't appreciate the opposition." "Hank doesn't appreciate anyone disagreeing with him, ever," Sarah sighed. "The worst part is, Hank and his boys were at the gas station yesterday when Viper was harassing Walter. They just stood there, watching. didn't lift a finger to help. Some men mistake cruelty for strength, Chuck said quietly. They respect bullies because they share the same values. Sarah looked at him sharply. You understand more than you let on, Mr. Norris. A small smile touched Chuck's lips. I've had some experience with men like Hank Dawson, and men like Viper for that matter. Sarah glanced at her watch and stood. I should get going. Walter will be closing up shop soon. She hesitated. You never answered my question, Mr. Norris, about looking out for Walter. Chuck rose and took her hand in a gentle but firm grip. I'll stop by his shop on my way to the motel, Ms. Jenkins. Make sure everything's all right. Relief washed over Sarah's face. Thank you. She turned to leave, then paused. For someone who's just passing through, you seem awfully invested in the welfare of strangers, Mr. Norris. Chuck's expression gave away nothing. Just trying to be a good neighbor, ma'am. Even if it is temporary. After Sarah left, Chuck watched as Hank Dawson and his men loaded supplies into their trucks and pulled out. Headed east the same direction as Walter's shop. Emily approached with his check, her expression darkening when she spotted Hank's distinctive red pickup. Hank Dawson. That man is a menace. So I've heard, Chuck replied mildly. Emily lowered her voice. Between you and me, he and Viper aren't so different. Hank just hides his meanness behind a business card and political connections. She hesitated. Someone told me that one of Viper's crew, the one with the spider tattoo on his face, he's Hank's nephew. Chuck set down his fork, his appetite suddenly diminished. Is that right? Emily nodded, realization dawning. You don't think. I think I should probably check on Mr. Jenkins, Chuck said, rising from his seat. 20 minutes later, Chuck approached Walter's auto shop on foot. 3 pickup trucks, the same ones he'd seen at the gas station, were parked haphazardly out front. The open sign had been flipped to closed, but the large garage door was partially raised. From inside came the sound of raised voices. Don't care what your excuses are, Jenkins. You've been a thorn in my side for years, and I'm tired of it. Hank Dawson's voice carried clearly. This is my property, Hank. Walter's voice was steady, but strained. You and your boys need to leave. Now. A chorus of mocking laughter followed. Then Hank again. Or what, old man? You gonna call your sister to save you? Or maybe your new friend, the big-shot celebrity? Chuck had heard enough. He ducked under the partially open garage door and entered the workshop. The scene inside was exactly as he'd expected. Walter standing with his back to a workbench, tools scattered around him, while Hank Dawson and his 5 companions formed a semicircle, effectively trapping him. One of Hank's men noticed Chuck first, nudging the others until awareness of his presence spread through the group. Hank turned, his expression shifting from surprise to contempt. Well, well. Look who decided to join us, boys, the Karate Kid himself. He straightened to his full height, crossing his arms over his chest. This is private business, mister. I suggest you turn around and walk away. Chuck ignored him, looking past the group to Walter. Everything all right here, Mr. Jenkins? Relief washed over Walter's face. Chuck, you shouldn't be here. Hank and his boys were just leaving. Doesn't look that way to me, Chuck observed mildly. He shifted his gaze back to Hank. Mr. Dawson, I presume? Hank's eyes narrowed. That's right. And this is my town, Norris. Just because you can push around some 2-bit bikers doesn't mean you can tell me what to do on my own turf. As the men squared off, tension crackled in the air like static electricity before a storm. What had begun as a simple act of kindness toward an old man in trouble was revealing itself to be something much more complex, a test of wills that would determine not just Walter's fate, but perhaps the future of Copper Creek itself. Night fell over Copper Creek like a heavy curtain, bringing stars that blazed against the black Texas sky. At the Desert Palms Motel, Chuck Norris sat outside his room, watching the empty highway that bisected the town. The confrontation with Hank Dawson that afternoon had ended surprisingly quickly after Chuck had neutralized two of Hank's men with effortless precision. The rancher had backed down, muttering threats but clearly unwilling to risk further humiliation. Walter had been overflowing with gratitude, insisting on buying Chuck dinner, but Chuck had declined, preferring solitude to celebrate. He'd picked up provisions at the small grocery store and retreated to the motel, seeking the quiet that had become his habit in recent years. His phone buzzed a text from his son checking in. Chuck replied briefly, sharing nothing about the events in Copper Creek. No need to worry his family with tales of bikers and small-town bullies. As he was about to put the phone away, headlights appeared in the distance motorcycles, approaching fast. Not just a few, but many. Their engines a growling chorus that shattered the night's quiet. Chuck counted at least 15 riders as they roared past the motel and continued into town. These weren't Viper's original crew. They wore different colors, rode different machines. Reinforcements. Chuck had expected something like this. Men like Viper didn't accept humiliation easily, especially not public humiliation. When their carefully cultivated image of toughness was shattered, they either slunk away in defeat or escalated dramatically. Viper had clearly chosen the latter. After the motorcycles passed, Chuck went to his room and retrieved something from his duffel bag, a small leather case, worn from years of handling. He slipped it into his pocket without opening it, then headed for his Jeep. As he drove toward Main Street, he noted the changes that had come over Copper Creek since nightfall. Unlike yesterday, when the town had seemed abandoned after dark, tonight there were lights on in many buildings. People stood in small groups on sidewalks, faces tense and watchful. Word of the bikers' return had spread quickly. The motorcycles were clustered in front of Rosie's diner, their chrome gleaming dully in the streetlights. Through the large windows, he could see the diner was packed, not just with bikers, but with locals as well. Though the two groups remained clearly separated, Deputy Wilson's patrol car was parked across the street. The deputy himself standing nervously by the diner's entrance, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Evening, Deputy," Chuck said quietly, approaching him. Wilson started, then relaxed slightly. "Mr. Norris, I was hoping you'd show up." He nodded toward the diner. "We've got a situation brewing in there. What's happening?" Wilson ran a hand through his thinning hair anxiously. "Viper came back with friends about 20 minutes ago. They're calling themselves the Serpent Brotherhood or some such nonsense. Took over the diner, ordered food and drinks, but they're not letting anyone leave." He swallowed hard. "They're asking for you. Anyone hurt?" "Not yet, but they've made it clear that could change." Wilson lowered his voice. "I called the sheriff's office, but it'll be at least half an hour before backup arrives." "Who's inside?" "Emily, the cook. About a dozen customers. And—" Wilson hesitated. "Walter and his sister came in just before the bikers showed up. Bad timing." Chuck's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I see." Wilson glanced at him nervously. "Look, Mr. Norris, I appreciate what you did yesterday, but this is different. These guys aren't just local troublemakers. Some of them have prison tattoos I recognize from the county jail. They're serious business." "I understand, Deputy." Chuck's voice remained calm, but there was a new resolve in it. "But we can't wait for backup. Not with innocent people at risk." "What's your plan?" Chuck studied the diner's layout through the window. "First, I need you to move your patrol car around to the back of the building. If this goes sideways, we'll need a clear path to get people out." Wilson nodded. "And then?" "Then I'm going to have a conversation with Viper." Chuck faced the deputy directly. "When I give you the signal, I'll raise my left hand. Like this, you come in through the back door. Focus on getting the civilians out, not on confronting the bikers." Wilson swallowed hard. "Okay, I'll move the car now." As Wilson hurried away, Chuck centered himself, drawing on decades of training and experience. Then, with deliberate, unhurried steps, he walked to the diner's entrance and pulled open the door. The conversation inside died instantly as all heads turned toward him. The scene was much as he'd assessed from outside. Bikers occupying most of the booths and counter seats, locals huddled together at tables near the back. Emily stood behind the counter, her face tight with controlled fear. Walter and Sarah Jenkins sat at a table near the kitchen door, Walter's expression a mixture of relief and alarm at Chuck's appearance. Viper sat in the central booth, surrounded by his new allies. His face still bore the marks of yesterday's confrontation, but there was a new confidence in his posture, bolstered by his reinforcements. Among them, Chuck spotted the man with the spiderweb face tattoo, Hank Dawson's nephew, looking particularly smug. "Well, look who finally showed up," Viper called out. "The man of the hour himself." Chuck remained by the door, taking in the full situation before responding. He noted the positions of all the bikers, the subtle bulges in jackets that suggested concealed weapons, the nervous glances exchanged by the locals. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and even. "I understand you've been looking for me." Viper's lips curled in a mockery of a smile. "That's right. Thought we should continue our conversation from this morning. With a few friends present this time." He gestured around at his crew. "Turns out I'm not the only one who thinks you need a lesson in minding your own business. These people have nothing to do with what's between you and me," Chuck said, nodding toward the locals. "Let them go, and we can talk." Viper laughed, the sound harsh and without humor. "That's not how this works, Norris. You embarrassed me in front of this whole town." His expression hardened. "So, now they get to watch what happens when someone crosses the Serpent Brotherhood." Chuck's gaze swept the room again, noting that Deputy Wilson had disappeared from view, presumably moving his car as instructed. "Is that what you're calling yourselves now? Sounds theatrical." Several of the bikers tensed at the implied insult, but Viper held up a hand to restrain them. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to get down on your knees and apologize for interfering in our business. Then you're going to crawl out that door and never show your face in Copper Creek again." "And if I don't?" Viper's smile widened, revealing stained teeth. "Then we start hurting people, one by one, until you change your mind." He gestured toward Walter and Sarah. "Maybe starting with the old man who caused all this trouble in the first place." Chuck took another step forward, placing himself directly in the center of the diner. "That's not going to happen." Viper snapped his fingers, and two of his crew moved toward Walter and Sarah's table. "We'll see about that." "Stop." Chuck's voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that froze the bikers mid-step. "This has gone far enough. You came here looking for me. Well, here I am. Leave these people out of it." For a long moment, silence reigned in the diner. Then Viper gave a slight nod, and his men retreated from Walter's table. "Fair enough. This is between you and me, and about 40 of my closest friends." Laughter rippled through the biker crew. Viper reached behind his back and pulled out a switchblade larger than the one from yesterday, its serrated edge gleaming wickedly in the diner's fluorescent lighting. Around him, his crew began to rise from their seats, hands moving to pockets and jackets where weapons were concealed. Chuck stood perfectly still, watching Viper with the same calm, assessing gaze he'd maintained throughout their encounters. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the small leather case he'd brought from his room. He flipped it open, revealing a badge worn but unmistakable, the golden shield of the Texas Rangers catching the light. "Actually," Chuck said quietly, "I'm placing you under arrest." Dawn broke over Copper Creek in a spectacular display of gold and crimson. In the small park that served as the town square, dozens of townspeople had gathered since first light. Some swept sidewalks, others planted flowers in neglected beds, all working together with purpose and energy that had been absent just days before. Chuck Norris sat on a bench at the edge of the park. Watching the transformation unfold, Walter Jenkins approached, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the gas station's convenience store. He handed one to Chuck and sat down with a slight groan. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Walter gestured toward the bustling volunteers. "Haven't seen the town like this since the tornado cleanup back in '98. Chuck accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "People coming together. Because of you," Walter said, his voice carrying quiet awe. "What you did last night. Hell, what you've done since you got here. It's changed things, Chuck." The previous night had ended peacefully after Chuck's badge revelation. Many of Viper's reinforcements had simply walked out, unwilling to risk assault charges against what they believed was a Texas Ranger. Sheriff Daniels had arrived with deputies to find Viper and his core crew subdued and ready for arrest. The hostage situation resolved without a single punch thrown. "Communities find their strength when they need it most," Chuck said. "Sometimes they just need a reminder of what they're capable of." Walter snorted softly. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Truth is, we let fear take over. Been letting it happen for months, years even." He shook his head, watching as Emily directed a group of teenagers in replanting a flower bed. Viper and his crew were just the most obvious symptom. They sat in companionable silence, observing the transformation around them. Sarah Jenkins distributed homemade cinnamon rolls among the workers. Deputy Wilson, looking more confident than before, helped an elderly woman repaint a bench. Even Hank Dawson had appeared, awkwardly helping unload bottled water from his pickup truck. His usual bluster nowhere in evidence. "Sheriff Daniels seemed like a reasonable man," Chuck commented, referring to the county sheriff who had taken Viper's crew into custody. Walter's expression soured slightly. "Daniels is all right, I suppose. But he's never been one to go looking for trouble." He glanced at Chuck. "Speaking of which, what exactly did you tell him about your professional status?" A small smile tugged at the corner of Chuck's mouth. "The truth, that I'm retired law enforcement, concerned about the welfare of a community under threat. But the badge," Walter began. Then understanding dawned on his face. "You're not really a Texas Ranger, are you?" Chuck's smile deepened slightly. "The badge belonged to my grandfather. He was a ranger for 30 years. I keep it as a reminder of what service and integrity look like." Walter stared at him for a moment, then burst into laughter. "You bluffed them! All those hard cases, ready to tear the place apart, and you bluffed them with a family heirloom." Chuck shrugged modestly. "Sometimes perception is all that matters." They were looking for an excuse to back down without losing face. Walter shook his head in wonderment. "Well, retired or not, you've done more good for this town in 3 days than most folks manage in a lifetime." They watched as Hank Dawson worked quietly, avoiding eye contact with most people, his usual dominance subdued. "People can surprise you," Chuck said simply. "Speaking of surprises," Walter said, his tone turning more serious. "Been thinking about your truck situation." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "My truck situation? You've been driving that rental Jeep. Not very practical for the long haul." Walter gestured down the highway. "A man ought to have his own wheels, especially on a cross-country trip." "I had a truck," Chuck admitted. "Broke down about 100 miles east of here. Transmission problems, according to the mechanic." Walter snorted dismissively. "Transmission problems. That's what they always say when they don't know what's really wrong." He took a sip of his coffee, then added casually, "I could take a look at it for you. We could go get it with my tow rig. Be there and back before dinner." Chuck studied him, recognizing in Walter's eager expression a need to repay a debt that couldn't truly be repaid, to extend their connection just a little longer. "That's very generous," Chuck said finally. "But I wouldn't want to impose on your time." Walter waved away the concern. Time is the one thing I've got plenty of these days. Shops closed for repairs after yesterday's excitement. His expression grew more serious. Truth is, Chuck, I'd consider it a personal favor. Give me a chance to do something for you. After all you've done for us. Before Chuck could respond, Emily approached, her cheeks flushed from exertion. We're having a gathering at the diner tonight. After we get it cleaned up. Nothing fancy. Just a thank you from the town. You'll both come, won't you? Chuck considered for a moment, then nodded. We'd be honored. As Walter and Chuck walked toward the tow rig minutes later, Chuck glanced back at the bustling town square. In just 3 days, Copper Creek had transformed from a place gripped by fear to a community rediscovering its strength. That had always been the real power. He reflected not in his fists or training, or even his grandfather's badge, but in showing people what was possible when fear no longer dictated their choices. You coming, Chuck? Walter called from the idling truck. Daylight's burning. Chuck smiled and climbed into the passenger seat. Perhaps his journey across the country wasn't so aimless after all. Perhaps life sometimes put you exactly where you needed to be, if that place was a dusty roadside town that most people would drive through without a second glance. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.